friend who was past 100. So when she got to 100, she says to her friends, "What do I tell them?" She says, "Just don't tell them." But I had one interview with Bernard Lewis, which blew me away.
Okay, we are ready here.
Thank you.
So, yeah, when you're ready, you can start.
Okay. Starting now, this is David Bedein with the Center for Near East Policy Research in Jerusalem. And it's my pleasure today to welcome Ken Abramowitz, who is visiting Israel. Actually, he doesn't only visit here, he lives 3 months a year in Israel. Originally, he actually also is in Florida. And Ken has an unusual job description. He's a national security threat specialist. And he comes from the world of business. And he'll first of all mention how he got to this position and what he does with it, both in Israel and in the United States and in Europe. Please, Ken.
Great to be with you today.
Thank you.
So I've been, all my working career, 45 years, has been as an analyst, a business analyst, analyzing the healthcare field. I work 6 days a week, every week. I only rest on Shabbat. On 9/11, I and everybody else was traumatized by what happened, who did it, why did they do it, who didn't stop them from doing it. So I decided as a concerned citizen to devote 1 day a week to national security, not as a job, just to learn. And so I started my national security career simultaneous with my healthcare career, but I was already 25 years into my healthcare career. And I spent 10 years teaching myself about national security. And then after 10 years, after 9/11, I thought I knew enough to start writing. So I started writing one-page pieces, two-page pieces, and handing them to congressmen, senators, governors, attorney generals, because I go to a lot of political events, or charitable events, and I meet people, and I used to give handouts. And then I decided to start writing articles when I set up my own website about 10 years ago.
What is that website, please?
SaveTheWest.com.
Okay.
SaveTheWest.com. And then I started writing articles every 2 weeks. And then that's now for 10 years. And then 5 years ago, I wrote a book called The Multi-Front War, which put together all of my thoughts that had been accumulating there. And then I subsequently published 4 editions of that book. And my 4th edition was just published last week. It's on Amazon and other similar type organizations. And when I update the book, I keep the book the same, I just add a new chapter. So I added a chapter for 2022, for 2024, and then most recently for 2025. And that's the one that's the 4th edition of the book.
Okay. Now, have you come to the conclusion that there are certain foci, certain enemies that are the focus of your work? Are there certain people who are, how should I say, in Hebrew we say michshol, people who are barriers to getting things done? Are there certain countries and certain corporations that are basically causing the trouble?
Yes, well, there's 2 in particular. There's the good guys and the bad guys.
Okay, now we're talking. We grew up in America in the 50s, and we knew about the bad guys and the good guys. And so this is easy for someone to understand who it doesn't like complicated stories, and you make it clear.
That's right. So there's 2 separate issues. The good guys are not good enough, and the bad guys are really evil. So I examine in my book and in my thoughts, why aren't the good guys as good as they should be? And why are the bad guys so bad?
Okay.
And so it's a comparative analysis of good and evil. And I tell people that we're in post-biblical times, but we're unofficially in biblical times.
Post-biblical times.
Well, officially, the Bible, the Torah, ended about 3,300 years ago with Moshe Rabbeinu's last words of advice for the early Israelites. But when I look at what's going on today, I say to myself and to others, we're unofficially in biblical times, because all the challenges that they had then, we have now, and all the challenges that we have now, they had then. The names have changed, of course, but the principles are the same. this principal battle of good versus evil, which permeates the Torah also, and the New Testament, also permeates what's going on today. So let's look at, and before we look at the bad guys, let me just give you a general expression that I use. Bad guys are good at being bad. Good guys are bad at being good.
Okay, we have to think about that, okay?
Right. So I try to encourage good guys, in other words, democracies, to be better. And I try to, I have no influence over bad guys, but they're the dictatorships. And I encourage the good guys to be tougher on the dictatorships, because the dictatorships have declared war on the democracies. Roughly half the people in the world live in a dictatorship, half the people in the world live in a democracy. This battle between good and evil, or between dictatorship and democracy, is as I said before, it's from biblical times. It's the traditional battle of all humans forever. Now, focusing on the bad guys, there's three really bad guys.
Okay.
I call existential enemies.
Existential enemies.
Existential enemies. In other words, they want to kill everyone in American Israel. They want to kill all Jews and Christians. And so now, number one, of course, is Iran, which also they want to kill Hindus, and they want to kill Sunnis. I call them a Islamo-Nazi death cult.
Islamo-Nazi death cult.
Right.
Okay.
Basically Hitler on steroids. Because Hitler wanted to kill Jews. Iran wants to kill Jews, Christians, and Hindus, and then the Sunnis. And that's a lot of people to kill.
Okay.
So that's why I call them a death cult. And they combine Nazism and Islamic jihad theories and put it together. So they're the master existential risk to everybody. Now, also existential risk is China and Russia. China wants to take over the world, and Russia wants to take over Europe, and if they could, then take over the world. And in the early days of Russia, 1917, when they illegally took over Russia, they announced that they want to export communism around the world. China, through a civil war, took over, the communists took over China in 1949. And they, in Russia, promptly agreed that they should take over the world. And then Islamism started 1,400 years ago with Muhammad and his followers. And Islamism is dedicating to take over the world. And its two prime examples now would be Iran on the Shiite side, which is roughly 15% of Muslims, and Qatar on the Sunni side, representing the other 85% of Muslims. They want to take over the world. So one of the things that the bad guys have in common are they want to take over the world. And they want to make us their slaves.
Us meaning?
Us meaning the democracies,
Okay.
the Western world, which would be Jews and Christians, but I include the Hindus. Hindus are not, in other words, India, are not traditionally considered Western civilization, but we're 98% the same. So I call that close enough. And one of the questions is, why do dictatorships, let me just finish on dictatorships.
Okay.
There's also the United Nations and all of its agencies, like your friends at UNRWA and
UNRWA meaning
United Nations
Relief
and Works Agency.
Okay.
And there's also the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. There's everything the United Nations touches is corrupt.
How did this, let me go back a little bit. When we were children, many of our parents brought us to meet the United Nations. I met Eleanor Roosevelt, was so impressed with her dedication to humanitarianism. We used to go trick-or-treat for UNICEF. How did this happen that this whole thing turned around?
Well,
in your assessment.
In the olden days, most normal people or criminals, the world's roughly 90% normal people, 10% criminals, wanted to work for businesses, because that's where you made money, in businesses. As governments became bigger and bigger and bigger, due to influences of socialism, communism, and also the voters. When you say there's an election, vote for me, people say, okay, what are you going to give me? What extra benefit? So over years and years of democracies, a couple hundred years, the voters are basically demanding subsidized or free goods. Well, now the government's so big that the criminals have realized the corporations are pretty honest organizations. Why don't I work for the government? And governments have become criminalized over the past 100 years as they grew bigger and bigger and bigger. So so one of the questions I ask myself, if there's 193 countries in the world, how many of them are run by criminal organizations? Well, my quick analysis is 180. And how did I get there? Well, I looked at all the countries, 7 or 8, who have announced that they're moving the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem.
Their local embassy.
Right, which had been in Tel Aviv.
Right.
They're moving it to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And another 5 countries have announced that they want to do that. So to make the math work out well, let's just say there's 13 countries that have either moved their embassy or have plans to move the embassy. Well, subtracting 13 from 193, you get 180. So my definition of a criminal country run by a criminal organization is they can't even move their embassy to Jerusalem, a 3,000-year-old city, when everybody else, almost everyone else, lives in a state that's relatively new. For example, England, France, Germany are roughly 1,000 years old. In the course of history, that's not so old. Jews have been in Jerusalem for 3,000 years. Jews have been around for 3,800 years. The Torah is 3,300 years old. So, by the way, America is 400 years old. So here you have 1,000-year-old countries telling 3,000-year-old countries how to behave. And so it's, anyways, I call the 180 criminal organizations pretending to be governments. So now, I would love to, in a perfect world, if I had a magic wand, we would have regime change in 180 countries, all the criminal organizations running all the criminal countries, and criminal organizations like the UN and its related agencies would be swept out, and you'd have honest people running them. But I don't have a magic wand. Mm-hmm. So the question then is, how do you focus our intellectual energy? And so I divide the bad guys into 3 categories, which I color code: the reds, the greens, and the blues.
The red, green, and blue.
Right.
Okay.
So the red's a traditional color for communists. That would be China, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Nicaragua, among others. The greens, color-coded green for Islam, but I'm not talking about Islam, I'm talking about Islamists. In other words, countries that want to impose Islam on somebody else. The Islamist countries would be Qatar and Turkey on the Sunni side, working to impose Islam throughout the Western world, through mosques, schools, radio, televisions, media, social media. And then you have the Shiite version, which would be Iran, trying to impose Islam around the world. And so, and then on the blues, you have the United Nations, United Nations and its related agencies. They're all corrupt. And then they're all criminal organizations. And then you have the World Economic Forum, the drug cartels, and many of the social media companies. I call them criminal organizations because they restrict freedom of speech and basically discriminate against conservatives, and generally discriminate against Jews, and often discriminate against Christians. I find that organizations that hate Jews, they also hate Christians because they hate God. In fact, one of the elements that unites virtually all the reds, the greens, and the blues is the hatred of God, our Judeo-Christian God, and hatred of the individual, hatred of individual rights, hatred of freedom of speech, and And I affectionately call the Reds, the Greens, and the Blues pagans. And so one of the analogies I use is from biblical times. Every biblical chapter I call Hashem versus the pagans. And sometimes the pagans win for a chapter. For example, the 10 plagues. The first 7 plagues, the pagans were winning. In the next subsequent chapter, plague 8 and 9, the pagans were winning. But on plague number 10, the death of the firstborn, all of a sudden, the forces of Hashem were victorious and the pagans lost.
Wow.
So today, the Reds, the Greens, and the Blues are simply modern recreations of the pagans. And they also have another thing in common. They all believe in child human sacrifice.
Child human sacrifice.
Right.
That's quite a statement.
Yes, but you see, they don't regard the individual as important. See, the hallmark of democracy in the Torah is the individual is supreme.
And the respect for the child.
Respect for every individual.
But especially the child.
Yes. Yes.
So that's where it begins.
Right. Mm-hmm. The bad guys have no regard for the individual, and individuals are regarded as cannon fodder. Because remember, if you're a red or green or blue, and you want to take over the world, which is a modest undertaking, right?
Right.
You have to kill a lot of people. Well, if you're going to kill a lot of people, that means a lot of your people are going to get killed along the way. But since you don't care about individuals, it doesn't matter. So you send an individual 18-year-old with a bomb strapped on their back or wherever, and they blow up 6 good guys, and that's considered a success. The fact that the 20-year-old died is just insignificant because just a casualty of war, so to speak, because they're sort of determined to take over the world. Everything else is detailed. So none of those countries care about the individual. We can see that in Russia, where Russia's lost something like 1 million people fighting to get a piece of Ukraine.
In the current war.
Yeah, in the current war. Mm-hmm. You know, why would someone want to do that? Why would a leader of a country say that Ukraine's an existential risk, which it wasn't, and say we have to take it over, which they didn't have to, and lose 1 million people and still want to fight? The Chinese had a one-child policy for 35 years or so. And during that time, when people gave birth to a girl, many times they killed the girl because they wanted a boy. If you only had one, the father wanted a boy, and so a lot of girls got killed. Doesn't matter.
Is there documentation to that extreme situation?
Well, there's certainly documentation of all the babies that weren't born. In other words, a normal country at that time was producing 2 babies per family. China was producing 1 baby per family. Mm-hmm. So 1 baby disappeared. It either disappeared because they were killed, or disappeared because they were aborted, or they were never conceived. I can't break it down
right.
as to which was which. But what kind of a society says we don't want more babies? If you said that to an Israeli family, we don't want more babies, they'd say, if you're capable of producing a baby and you have the resources for a baby, you want a baby. So Israel personifies life. By the way, Israel's the mother of civilization, the mother of Western civilization, the mother of democracy. So the mother wants babies. That's what mothers want, babies. And so Israel is the antithesis. And representing all of Western civilization is the antithesis to the Reds, the Greens, and the Blues. Now, by the way, America is down to 1.7 babies.
1.7.
Yeah. Europe is like 1.3. And I've read that Japan and South Korea are down to 1.0. Now, that's not due to some forced pressure from the government, but those societies don't have faith in their future. And so they figure, why produce babies? Babies are expensive. They wake up in the middle of the night. They're a lot of work. And if you're self-centered, you say, well, I'd rather go on vacation. Let's go to the theater. I don't want to change diapers. So, but Israel, as the mother of Western civilization, has the highest birth rate at 3, in round numbers 3, and it's moving up as more religious elements of society grow. The rate will go to 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, which is a marvel to behold. But anyways, just to conclude, the reds, the greens, and the blues, they basically hate societies. They have a vision of who they are, and then they hate everybody else. So they're not open to others. I mean, Israel and America, for example, are a refuge for everybody in the world. Over the past 100 years, how many people have moved to America, Israel? My grandparents came from Lithuania about 100 years ago. And if they hadn't, I wouldn't be here with you today, right? And so America's a welcoming society. Israel's a welcoming society. And those societies, the reds, the greens, and the blues, are top-down, not bottom-up societies. And so the dictator decides what he wants, and that's what he gets. And anyone who disagrees is eliminated from the political system or from the world, so to speak. So we also have other enemies besides the reds, the greens, and the blues, although they fit into the construct of reds, greens, and blues. So I'll give you an example. We have allies, in quotes, allies. I'm talking about America, but Israel also. We have allies like England and France, and Canada and Mexico, which obviously directly border on America. These, so to speak, allies aren't acting like allies very much, because half of their society has been taken over by the reds, the greens, and the blues. In other words, their educational system, kindergarten to 12, the teachers' colleges, the universities, have allowed these false pagan ideologies, the reds, the greens, and the blues, to invade. Not with soldiers, but with ideas or false narratives into their societies, into their media. And so every year, England and France act less like allies, and Canada and Mexico act less like allies. So I'll give you an example. England and France have allowed open borders. So they've been invaded by non-French, non-Brits, obviously, and non-Canadians. And they tolerate it. In fact, they left the borders open. So someone thought it was a good idea. And now France is 10% Muslim, England is 5 on its way to 10, Canada is roughly 5 on its way to 10. And as that happens, what the Greens, the Muslims, work with the Reds, the local communists and socialists, and start forming majority governments, even though each of them are a distinct minority of the population. They work together and create a red-green alliance, and they work with the blues, the globalists. And therefore, the countries are not capable of defending themselves anymore because they've been half or more taken over by the enemies. So when you look out a generation or two, and I highlighted this in my book, The Multi-Front War.
The Multi-Front War is your book. And
Right. 4th edition.
Okay, and this is available on Amazon?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the other normal internet sites. And I highlighted this, that England and France have nuclear weapons. America cannot stand by and watch England and France self-destruct because those nuclear weapons can be pointed at America. So America now has an existential problem with England and France, but has no clue that it has that problem. We also have an existential risk with Canada because the Islamist terrorists are just coming down from the north and invading America. And Mexico is basically controlled by the drug cartels, which I put in the blue category because they're global organizations. So Canada and Mexico are becoming existential risks to America. France and England are becoming existential risks to America. They're also becoming existential risks to Israel, because as they decline due to the influence of the reds and the greens and the blues, they can say things like, I just saw in the newspaper, they want to restrict visas for Israelis, or they can restrict exports, or they can restrict university professors. You know, as you know, university professors like to go for sabbatical years to different universities to expand their knowledge base. And they can use the excuse that they're Jews, and Israel is a barbaric country creating genocide. All false narratives, all the false narratives of the reds, the greens, and the blues permeate the political system. And then they have politicians accusing Israel of genocide. Israel was the victim of genocide on October 7th. And then they flip reality and then accuse Israel of genocide and say, therefore, we can't give you a visa. We can't have your professor here. We can't trade with you in Judea and Samaria. Jews have been in Judea and Samaria for 3,800 years. Brits have been in Britain for 1,000. Can you imagine if we say to the Brits, oh, you've only been in England for 1,000 years, we can't trade with you. You're not the indigenous population.
I want to go back to something you said earlier. You were talking about children. We grew up in America in the 50s. There were a lot of advertisements, a lot of there was a company that babies are our business, our only business. A lot of pro-child. It was the generation after World War II. Can you give some insight into how that all changed? This is the pro-baby, the baby boom, and how it deteriorated.
Well, if I had to pick a year, I'll pick 1962. Now, you may say, why did you pick 1962? In 1962, I was 12, and the American Supreme Court made a decision that we cannot have school prayer in our schools.
In our public schools.
Public schools. Now, 85% of the people go to public schools. About 10% of the people go to private schools in America. 5% are homeschooled. So for the 85% of the people at public schools, we couldn't have the 2 minutes that we had. I still remember, I was sitting down, and the teacher says, okay, it's time for prayer. You can say anything you want. The teacher didn't give you the prayer. She said, it's prayer time, 2 minutes, say something to yourself about your religion. So everyone did their thinking, and that was it. It wasn't the school telling you what to think. It was you and your family telling you what to think. So the Supreme Court decided that that was terrible. That we have to have a separation between church and state. And so, therefore, we can't have school prayer anymore. Well, that was unilateral disarmament for the cultural war. If you say that God, our Judeo-Christian God, however someone conceptualizes that, can't be even thought about in school because we have to have a separation of church and state. What happens when you take God out of the school? So during the Republican convention by Zoom during the COVID times, there was an impassioned black pastor who said, my mama told me that when you take God out of the society, the devil marches in. Uh-huh. And I listened to him on Zoom, and I said, yes, this pastor had it right, and his mama had it right. And so the reds, the greens, and the blues are the devil. They are the pagans. And when we unilaterally disarmed, not in terms of weapons, but in terms of thinking, and said we cannot discuss Judeo-Christian culture in our schools, the reds, the greens, and the blues marched right in. And that's the devil, in that pastor's analogy, or the pagans. And that subverted all traditional Judeo-Christian values. a major Judeo-Christian value is babies. And they undermined the babies and the mother ever since. And that's why we went from 2.5 to 2.0 to 1.7. But Israel didn't fall for that nonsense and is at 3.2 and on its way up.
One last insight. In the current negotiations between Israel and the Arab countries, the one issue which has been neglected has been education. While the Palestinian Authority, which is the nice way of saying the Palestine Liberation Organization, has created an education system to enforce their values, it's been ignored. How do we reverse that process, in your opinion?
Well, the whole Oslo Accord process was a mistake. But if you wanted to, and within the mistake, there were 15 mistakes. But one of the big mistakes was not keeping control over the educational system. Right. Israel should have said that if you're going to have autonomy, it's going to be with our books, with our school books and our teachers. Of course, the PA never would have accepted it. It would have ended the Oslo Accords. But Israel should have said, we're not going to allow your false narrative, what I call death cults, false narrative, to permeate the schools. Because when you infect a 5-year-old becomes an 18-year-old. 5-year-old goes to college. You can give that person a gun or a bomb. They can vote. So it set off a cascade of mess in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza, and we saw the fruits of that on October 7th.
Right.
Come back to haunt Israel. You cannot give control of your narrative, your Judeo-Christian narrative, to outsource it to somebody else, and in particular outsource it to a death cult, because you see what happens.
Well, thank you. As we wind up, tell us a little about your family.
Well, I have two kids, 5 grandkids, and my wife's from Israel. And when my daughter gave birth to our 5th grandchild, her 2nd child, I said to her, but we need 10 grandchildren. And she said, Dad, if you wanted 10 grandchildren, you could have had more children first. So my advice to everybody is have more children.
Okay. I want to thank you, Ken Abramowitz, for being our guest today here in Jerusalem. And this is a marvelous insight you've given to, in a sense, good and evil, and which everybody should learn about, which is the ABC of life. Thank you, Ken Abramowitz, for being guest of the Center for Near East Policy Research today. All the best to you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
For years, negotiations have been ongoing with Iran to limit its military power. They have now come to a head in Washington. Few people, however, have discussed what will happen if the billions in frozen Iranian assets are actually released to Tehran. For decades, Iran has been a source of funding and weapons for Hezbollah and Hamas. Hezbollah has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans in Lebanon, and is believed to have blown up Jewish buildings in Argentina. Those bombings in Argentina killed over 100 people. Argentina's former top prosecutor, who was recently murdered, accused Hezbollah of operating in more than 10 countries as an Iranian proxy. The other proxy of Iran is Hamas. The flow of arms and funds from Iran to Gaza has helped create a network of tunnels and a well-stocked arsenal of rockets, drones, and other deadly weapons. In Iran, leaders have been steadfast in their support for Hamas and continue to vow to arm the Palestinians.
دنیا و به خصوص دنیای اسلام موظفند هر چه میتوانند به تجهیز ملت فلسطین کمک کنند.
With the promise of billions in cash and weapons, Hamas continues to prepare for its next war. This past summer, we visited the Gaza Strip, where Hamas held military training camps for 15,000 boys and girls. These children are students in schools run by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. At the UNRWA schools, the kids are taught that they have the right of return by force of arms to villages that their families left in 1948. This summer's military camp was a mix of nationalism, radical Islam, and brainwashing, convincing the kids to become child soldiers. The campers and counselors were eager to express their yearning for jihad and martyrdom.
في سبيل الله نمضي في سبيل الله نمضي في سبيل الله نمضي في سبيل الله نمضي. في قطاع غزة يوجد أكثر من 50 مخيم، العدد اللي التحق فيه أكثر من 15,000 فارس من فرسان حماس. في البداية احنا بدينا في المحاضرات الأخلاقية والتعبئة والتوجيه، كانت عن القرآن الكريم ثم أخلاق الشاب المسلم، ثم بدأت بالتدريبات العسكرية وفتح الميدان وتدريبات اللياقة والمشاة العسكرية، ثم تلاها تدريبات على السلاح وفن التعامل مع السلاح. كسرنا حاجز الخوف عند هؤلاء الفتية أو الشباب في مقتبل عمرهم. الشباب استطاعوا اقتحام النيران، تفجير. في الأمس كان هناك تفجير المغتصبات الصهيونية، كانت هناك أجسام، وتعلموا فن استعمال المتفجرات وتفجيرها.
عن طريق خطف الجنود ونعمل عمليات استشهادية والمقاومة.
نقول لهم انتظرونا بني صهيون فسوف نجز رقابكم وسوف ندمر بيوتكم ونحرق بيوتكم فوق رؤوسكم ونهدمها فوقكم وإنا قادمون.
نقول لهم والله لنأتينهم عن قريب وسنقطع رقابهم بإذن الله.
احنا في غزة عايشين فقط للجهاد والمقاومة، يعني ما لنا في حياتنا إلا الجهاد والمقاومة وعبادة الله سبحانه وتعالى.
حق العودة مقدس مهما طال الوقت، لكن سيعود، والدولة الإسرائيلية دولة زائلة زائفة. مهما طال الوقت فستزول، ولن نعترف نحن أيضا نحن لن نعترف بإسرائيل إطلاقا. طبعا أنا انضميت لمخيم فرسان حماس حبا في استرجاع الوطن الفلسطيني وحبا في الموت في سبيل الله. الصواريخ هي حلنا الوحيد لاسترجاع الوطن. طبعا لا أرضى إطلاقا، لأن هذا التقسيم يمس بأوضاع المسلمين في فلسطين، وهذا يعتبر تدنيس للمسجد الأقصى.
احنا نتمنى إنه يوم من الأيام نقدر نطلعهم كلهم من القدس وندوس على رقابهم وعلى رؤوسهم، لأنه هم جنسوا دياناتنا وجنسوا الأماكن المقدسة عنا.
ايوه داوم زحف، يلا اسرع من هيك.
أن أتعلم الرجولة وأرجع أراضينا المحتلة وأحرر الأسرى من بين الاحتلال.
تعلمت أن أدافع عن أرضي، وجيت هنا عشان أحرر الأقصى، عشان القدس معروفة للعرب مش لليهود. أنا أرض وقف إسلامي، ما ينفعش ولا واحد يفرط فيها.
القدس بس للمسلمين، للعرب والمسلمين بس، واليهود ما لهمش شيء في القدس.
بإذن الله سنحررها بدمائنا وبدماء شهدائنا بإذن الله تعالى، بالاستشهاد والعمليات الاستشهادية بإذن الله.
This year, for the first time, Hamas recruited young girls to its military camps. Here, Hamas Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh congratulates the girls at a camp banquet.
وما هذه المخيمات التي نحن بصدد الاحتفاء بها الآن إلا الامتداد لهذه الجهود المباركة ولهذا العمل المتواصل في مشروع التحرير والعودة إلى القدس والأقصى.
Listen to their counselors talk about their aspirations to become warriors.
فنحن هذه القدس لنا، هي عاصمتنا ليس لليهود. هم يزعمون أن لهم الهيكل المزعوم، هو ليس لهم، هو هيكل سليمان ليس لهم. القدس لنا نحن فقط، للمسلمين فقط. هؤلاء اليهود الخنازير ليس لهم لا قدس ولا معالم في المسجد الأقصى، هم لهم فقط بيوت الخنازير وليس لهم في الأقصى.
القدس لا تسترد إلا بالسلاح وبسلاح المقاومة، ورسالتي إلى المقاومة أوجهها أن امسكوا، ارفعوا سلاحكم في وجه المحتل، أن اتحدوا في وجه المحتل حتى تحرير القدس وكامل فلسطين إن شاء الله.
The girls performed a war dance for the Prime Minister. At the boys' camps, the children were trained for combat and guerrilla warfare. Iranian funding for Hamas and Hezbollah serves as a lifeline for their goal, war against Israel. Billions in new Iranian funds will guarantee a new generation of motivated and trained killers. Is that what the world needs today?